And what I'm here to talk to you about today is, have you ever had a moment where you've really made a big mistake? In fact, I've just had one of those moments, which I'll tell you about in a little while. So hold on. But first off, I just want to ask you is, I bet you don't remember who Dr. Robert Kelly is, but I do think that you will remember his video. He was the man who was broadcasting to the BBC when his little girl came into the room. And the BBC broadcaster said to him, "I think one of your children has just come in." And he sort of pushed the child aside, upon which part of his pile of books on the desk fell off. And then you can see just behind him, coming through the door, is a baby on one of those baby walkers. And you see the walker edging through, and you just know what's coming. It's absolutely hysterically funny. So then the baby comes in, and then following that, his wife comes in on her hands and knees because she's trying not to be seen, and removes the children. And then off camera, you can hear them screaming. It is such a funny video. It really is, because it's this sort of inevitability of it, of what's actually happening, and that he's not going to be able to do anything about it. And do look it up on YouTube. It is just really funny. But can you imagine what it felt to be Dr. Robert Kelly on that day? How embarrassed he must have felt. There he was, trying to be professional, trying to give a professional opinion. You know what it's like. I'm sure this has happened to you as well. In fact, if you can pop in the comments, have you ever had an interruption in your counselling session where it wasn't something that you expected? Perhaps someone knocked on the door, or there was some sort of noise, or somehow family life intervened. If that's you, pop that in the comments and let me know, because actually I think it happens to very many of us. And I can remember one time when I was, I'd actually been out to a party, had a little amount to drink. I was out at a party. And when I came home, I was scrolling through Facebook. I went upstairs to get undressed, and I left Facebook on. And then I went to pick it up. And to my absolute horror, I realised that I was live feeding and I'd got undressed. I was looking at myself live on Facebook with no clothes on. So panic stations. I wasn't that drunk that I couldn't turn it off. I sort of very quickly turned it off and deleted the video. Unfortunately, no one saw, but I shall never forget that feeling of, oh my goodness, I have just appeared nude on a Facebook live feed. Fortunately, no one saw it. So if you're ever worried about what people might think of you if you do a video, really, truthfully, I do understand what it might feel like. But actually, these mistakes make us human. And the reason I'm talking about this today, about being real, rather than being perfect, is it is the subject of what Samantha Lee and I talk about in my Good Enough Counsellors podcast. And we've called it, I've decided to call it, The Myth of the Perfect Therapist. Absolutely brilliant title. It just really summed up what the podcast is all about. But little did I realise how relevant it was going to be on this particular day for this particular live feed, because Samantha's just contacted me and said, "Oh, Jo, can you send me some details over so I can put it for my social media for Thursday?" So I thought, well, the easiest thing to do is just take a screenshot of what the podcast is about on Apple Podcasts. So I went to Apple Podcasts and I did a screenshot, and then I looked down and I thought, why is the episode with Sam showing up on Apple Podcasts? And to my horror, I realised that I've actually accidentally pressed publish on it. So The Myth of the Perfect Therapist is absolutely spot on, because I haven't been perfect in my podcast publishing. So it's really quite funny that that's happened to me today, on the day where I talked about the myth of the perfect therapist. So what I thought it might be interesting to talk about actually is what you can do, because I know that so many of you are frightened about being on social media, and you're frightened of making a mistake. And in fact, you're probably quite frightened of making a mistake, because you want to look after your clients, and you may well be very frightened about making a mistake actually in your counselling as well. So I thought it might be just a little bit useful to talk about some sort of ways of being compassionate towards yourself. The first thing is, I think, is to acknowledge the feelings, because this is part of how we can be compassionate towards ourselves, is to acknowledge that actually you feel really scared. It is a scary thing to think about. What if I make a mistake? Will I be shown up? When I just published the podcast just now, I just thought, oh my goodness, I've made a mistake. What can I do? Do I, it's out of the schedule? Do I delete it? What do I do about it? So what I did was I reached out to Charlotte, my podcast producer, for support. I said, tell me it's okay to have published a podcast at the wrong time. And she immediately answered and said, yeah, that happened to me on holiday, she said. So there's nothing I could do about it. So I went back to my vodka slushy. That's Charlotte for you. So it's really helpful to know that when you make a mistake, that you are not alone. But feeling worried and scared about it is one of the feelings that you're going to have. And I think acknowledging that to yourself and acknowledging that feeling frightened about making a mistake is a perfectly normal human reaction that can sort of help. And to know that you're not alone. Like I said, I contacted Charlotte and she immediately told me, I'm not the first person to have made that mistake, and I probably won't be the last. And I think even if, you do make a mistake in your therapy, and it feels, and I believe me, I have made mistakes in therapy, and it feels you feel so ashamed. It's excoriating, awful, awful, awful. But you aren't alone if you've made a mistake. And I think often what can happen is, it's like any relationship where there's ruptures, you then have to do the work to make the repair. And I think, looking back on some of my mistakes, sometimes I've been able to make those repairs, sometimes I haven't. But I think it goes a long way to just hold your hands up and to admit that actually you have made a mistake. And I think clients can be very forgiving of that if that's the case. But I think the thing to do is just to acknowledge to yourself that it is really hard, that it is part of the human experience. And I think sort of the other thing that I'm learning at the moment is that while it feels uncomfortable, and the thought of making a mistake feels uncomfortable, part of being real with ourselves is actually acknowledging that we feel this discomfort, but that shouldn't be a reason for us to stop. So I'll say that again. We feel the discomfort, but that shouldn't be a reason for us to stop. It is a natural part of the human condition to make mistakes. It's a natural part of the human condition to have regrets, to wish that we could have done things differently. I really, really hope that, I don't make some horrendous mistake. And there's a fear of making mistakes, most definitely. But also, I think we have to be kind to ourselves and acknowledge that this is part of being human. And sometimes we just do. And then the thing is I think to find the people who can really support you, who can really get alongside you, like I did with Charlotte today. Someone who understands, someone who can really empathise with what it feels like. It might be a supervisor, it might be a colleague, it might be a friend, it might be a partner or a relation. You get that support so that you can reassure yourself that you are just being human, that this is a normal part of the human experience. And remind yourself that actually this is something that is, in a way, what we're doing when we make mistakes is we're showing clients that we're human, and that's not a bad thing, actually, to admit that we're human, because it actually gives our clients and our followers, if it's on social media, permission to be human too. I think that's a really, really important thing to remember. So in closing, I'd just like to remind you that Sam's lovely, lovely podcast interview with me is now out. Sam is full of wisdom. It's such a lovely interview. And she's got so much wisdom, especially sort of if you're in private practice or you're trying to develop your social media. She's got so much wisdom for you. But as well, you know, if you're someone who's had trauma in your past, she talks about the inner child and how inner child therapy can help you. So I think you're going to love the episode, and I'd love it for you to have a listen.